Hey, everybody.
Hello, everyone.
Welcome.
How are we all?
Hey, Matt. Good to see you.
Hey, Bruce. Good to see you too. How's your week been?
It's been all over the place. We've been to Hobart and other places. It's been good.
Lucky you. Yes, that's that wonderful outside world that you can still escape to for those of
Yeah.
us who are locked up indoors.
Yes.
So, yes, good fun, good week. Thanks for watching, the people who are here. We have learnt a lot from last week. Bruce has learnt loads from last week. I've learnt loads from last week in operating this and running it. Today's topics, like you can see that we're talking about, is frame rates and how do they work. There's probably 4 to 5 key items that Bruce is going to cover today. So frame rates, 25 frames a second to 30 frames a second, the differences between them, plus the quirky little specialist ones in there that don't really mean much, but you might see them in settings here and there.
Yep. We're going to cover lots of different stuff, but not crazy detailed. Like, obviously, every topic has a very, very deep bucket, but enough to get you out of trouble, hopefully.
Enough to get you out of trouble. So for frame rates, 25 frames a second, 30 frames a second. Frame rates for slow motion, the 180 rule, overcranking, speed ramping, and time lapse. And you will get to know what overcranking and speed ramping is as Bruce presents them throughout our next hour of session. So I will be again off in the background, monitoring the chat and picking up any questions that you've got. So do put them in there. And yes, for those who know Bruce on the Facebook and the real world, a very big happy birthday to Bruce today.
Thank you.
Yes. Cool.
Anyway, it's not about that. It's about what we can make.
About what we can make. So let's jump in today. I'll turn camera and mic off. You'll hear me and maybe see me jump in as we go along. Over to you, Bruce.
Yeah, cool. So I'm going to talk about, we're going to talk about frame rates as we just discussed. And this is kind of basic. So I'm aiming this towards video for photographers, particularly ones that haven't gone into video much or wanting to. So I'm just going to throw my screen share on, if I can get the buttons to work. We'll go to picture in picture. So, the definition of frame rate is frames per second, or FPS. You'll see it as FPS pretty much everywhere these days. Is the speed in which individual frames, like pictures, photos, are known as a frame in this instance in filmland, are captured by a recording device and then projected or displayed on a screen. So you're watching this on a computer monitor, and that monitor is refreshing and showing frames over and over again, and which is called frame rate. So cameras, unlike a still camera where you take one frame and that's it, this will take X amount of frames, depending what you set it to display the art of motion, basically. So it's the fundamental thing of why when somebody took a stills camera and decided to make movies or motion out of it, that's what we ended up with. So this is the glorious land of video and cinematography. So when we talk about that, let me just, we're going to come out of that. We talk about different types of frame rates. Now, cinema, which is the classic frame rate out there, is 24 frames per second. So it's 24 individual images shown to you per second. That is to give enough motion, enough detail to actually give you the illusion of motion. Earlier films, if you've looked at historical stuff, are actually lower than that because they were hand cranked or things, or the motors were different. And you'd see like 16 frames and 12 frames. Animation, particularly from the 80s and earlier, was done at 12 frames. And then they took 2 pictures to actually get it to elongate enough for motion on television and in cinema. So 24 is the standard one you'll hear about for movies in the cinema. 25 is what we have here in Australia, which is called PAL. Can't even remember what PAL stands for, but that doesn't matter. So it's all about the frequency of our electricity in Australia, we're 240 volt at 50 hertz. So our actual way of it back in the day, I'm not exactly sure why, but we ended up with 25 frames. So it's half the frequency of our electricity. And so it's slightly off cinema, but close enough. And it's called PAL. Now, PAL is the minority in the world. The majority is NTSC, or 30 frames a second, which is America and most countries. YouTube and streaming services and that prefer 30 frames a second. A lot of them caught up and allow you to do different frame rates, but 30 is what broadcast television is in America. Now, we hinted at there's some weird specialty frame rates out there, and you'll see them. I'm more noting them for if you're in a settings and you see these weird ones, which are like 23.97 and 29.97 or variations of. They are old school broadcast standards, which you don't need to worry about. So if you see them, unless there's a good reason for it, ignore them. They were literally because when black and white switched to color back in America, there wasn't enough information bandwidth to actually put color information in. So they slightly reduced the frame rate to be able to add color information. And that was, and it's, then they had to do what's called a telecine, which is to take the projection of a movie, say 24 frames a second, up to NTSC. So that's a bit of a weird backstory. If you see it, ignore it. You don't need to worry about it. But I wanted you to know about it because you look at it and go, why do they exist? Do I need to know about these? So it's a really quick, easy way to know about it and just put it out of your head and ignore it and move on to other things. So
Bruce, before you jump forward there quick
Yep.
question from Mr. Glazebrook, who is watching. Hello. If you're producing for a global market, would you produce in 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second or 25? I would probably go more 30 if you're producing for an international and overseas.
It depends on your output and the platform you're going to. If it's a broadcasting, they'll give you the spec. If it's just an online thing, particularly, I don't think it matters too much. There's a good reason to use 25 here, and that is if you're in a mixed lighting environment with generally cheaper lights, or sometimes televisions and stuff, they, depending on what settings they are at, they can flicker. And you can avoid a lot of that by matching the frequency of the flicker, or at either the actual frequency, 50 or at 25, which is half. You won't see it as much, if at all. If you're producing for a global platform, which is not online, if it's for broadcast or something like that, they will tell you what they're expecting. So follow those rules.
Great. Very good.
Yeah. So let's have a look at some of the examples here of where you can use different frame rates. And this is in the capture. So the actual recording, you might set your recordings in different ways. So 16 frames or less, roughly, is like the old silent movie era. And that's the reason why it feels choppy and jerky in that. And there's been some cool videos where people used AI to create the individual frames in between which are missing to smooth that motion out, which is actually quite of interesting, seeing a 100-year-old silent film reel go into smooth motion. You can look those up online on YouTube, and that's some really cool stuff. And Peter Jackson did a documentary on World War I where he spent the whole time doing that. And it's crazy because it really gives you a visceral effect of seeing something feel more like real life. 24, as we talked about, it's very much the standard for cinema and on the output, but also on the recording. 30 frames is what you'll see a lot of cameras come out as, particularly webcams and things like that, because that's for an online environment or broadcast and that. If you buy a camera in Australia with video capabilities, most of the time it's set to 25, or there'll be a selector in there that says PAL or NTSC. A lot of times they will be selected to PAL because if you bought it in Australia, it'll already be set for that region. But if you buy it overseas or if you buy grey market, don't do grey market, by the way, it'd probably be set to NTSC. Then you've got other ones like 60 frames a second where we're going sort of double the frame rate, 50 and 60. You'll actually see a lot of sports and that also shot in this because they can do a bit of slow-mo and things like that, but you might want to use it for really crisp looking video. And this is where the TV effect comes in, because if you go up to those higher frame rates and you can bring it down with a really sharp and quick shutter, it feels very video, what they call it, the soap opera effect. And then we've got larger frame rates from that 120 frames a second, which is sort of the thing a lot of people like using on YouTube and that now, because you can slow it up to 4 times and get really big slow-mo. And then you can go further than that, 240, 480, 960 plus. There's cameras out there called the Phantom, which are scientific cameras, which are used by scientists and that, but also a great YouTube channel called Slow Mo Guys, and that where they actually shoot like glass breaking things you cannot audibly or visually see, but you know it happens, lightning and stuff like that, and then bring it down to a perceptual speed. And say like a second might, if it was playback at real time, so you take the 1,000 frames and bring it down to 25, it might take 4 hours to watch that second worth of footage, or more, depending on what speed you set your camera at.
So I think Australian Open did that probably about 4 or 5 years ago from memory, Bruce. They brought in the 100,000 frames a second cameras or so.
Yep.
And they showed everyone in ultra super slow-mo, balls bouncing, them hitting the strings, rackets, all sorts of things that you just don't see with the naked eye normally. So it was a really insightful just to see what the tennis ball goes through when it's going across the court.
Yeah, I love that stuff. Slow Mo Guys. I've actually worked with Gavin from Slow Mo Guys years ago, and awesome stuff. It's just so much fun watching things in slow mo and seeing those details. But yeah, that's how a lot of broadcast cameras for high end sport like AFL and like cricket and tennis and that have slightly faster speed cameras. They're really expensive ones. So they can do those instant replays, but do them slow. Like, is it a LBW in cricket or something like that? That's how they do that. But they've got big systems to manage that data, and how they do the playbacks is pretty amazing. So that's broadcast, and that's another thing. But for us, most of the time when you're doing interviews and doing stuff like this, you want to sit at that 24, 25 frames a second mark, or 30 if you're in the States or somewhere. But you might want to use these other frame rates for creative or problem-solving things. So let's have a look. I'll have a look at my notes. You got a question there?
No, I was just going to say welcome along, William. No problem. Everyone has internet issues. We do live in Australia where the internet is still run by mouse.
Yes. No, we are not going to get into politics there.
So let's jump into some of those great examples that we were talking about and the things that you've shot.
Yeah. So one of the things that goes hand in hand with your frame rate is your shutter. Before we get to the example, we need to talk about this. So you might hear about it. It's called the 180 rule. And the actual thing about 180 is from back in film camera days, and to do with the mirror and that. You can look it up. It's really cool. There's some demos out there of why it's like that. But anyway, the general rule is if you're at 25 frames a second, then your shutter needs to be double. So in this instance, 25, we'll go back to full screen. We go 25 frames a second, then your shutter needs to be at 1/50th. Or if you're at 30 frames seconds, then you need to be at 1/60th. The reason why that is that it's the most optimal and closest version of sharpness versus motion blur to cinema and what we're used to seeing, what is pleasing to us, what we've learnt over the years without it being too TV-like or video-like. This is where people sit at. Now, if you slow the shutter down, you'll get a lot more motion blur, and if you speed the shutter up, you'll get a lot clearer vision. There are reasons for doing both. Now, herein lies the thing for us as videographers or photographers going into video. There is an issue once you set these boundaries, right? If you've got a set shutter, then you're tied into a box where you've blocked one wall off, which you can't do. You can't move your shutter, or if you want to keep your shutter at that spot for the particular motion blur and sharpness, then you're relying on your ISO, which at times you don't even want to change, when that's a topic for another live stream. And also then you're stuck with your aperture, and then you may not have depth of field you want and stuff like that. So this will
this
play
this
into it.
this is effectively that same decision triangle in photography, just applied to motion, and
Yes.
the rules that are there and how the rules can be broken, need to be broken sometimes to obtain an outcome, but how they can be broken and what you can do to recover them.
And so obviously then another topic for a different broadcast, but then you've got to think about it that you're not got the same latitude to play with like in stills, because you can't easily shoot at 180th or change this or change that. So your boxes change because of this requirement of time and shutter and frame rates. So it's something to look at, and we could probably go into the depth into the triangle on a different one, but we're going to talk about shutter here and the frame rates just as and ignore the ISO and the requirement of f-stop and the other things for the moment. So if you've got questions about that, definitely ask at the end of this. But I think we'll do a bigger show where we talk about how to compensate for those walls that you may hit when trying to keep, say, this nice motion that you like. Okay, so let's have a look. So standard motion for us in Australia is 25 frames a second at 1/50th. So I've just gone out and shot a couple of bits of footage, and it's what you expect. It's nice and smooth, as long as the playback on my machine's smooth. There's a little bit of motion blur in those cars. Everything else is pretty sharp. That's exactly what we expect. And here's my daughter jumping jacks or whatever, and spraying some water. You can see that there. Let's go here. You can see here, there's nice blur in that water motion coming out. You can see a little bit of individual drops, but depending on how fast the object is when it's captured, is how much blur you get. But it's never going to be tack sharp. So she's not moving the actual spray very fast, so it's quite sharp. But here, very blurry, and that's just what we expect to see when we're actually watching video. So that is our usual. So when you're using, we'll get to overcranking in a second. So when you're actually setting up your camera, these are the things you're going to need to take consideration of. You want to look at that frame rate you're on, check your settings, and just get your shutter in the right spot and that. And then if, as photographers, you're going to have to make decisions whether you to stop overexposure, underexposure, upping your iris or changing your ISO. To get what you want there. And if you've got ND filters and that, there are a good option, and they are used heavily in cinema to actually control the light coming into your camera. Right. So when you get to that and you got nice motion in that, but sometimes you want to use a faster shutter. And this is called overcranking. Classic example is the beginning of Save It Private Ryan, the Steven Spielberg film, which felt really visceral on the beach, and it's like got this crazy feel to it, and it's because they literally overcrank the camera, so there's very little motion blur in it, and it feels staccato-ish. That's because they're gone. I don't know what it was, but they went to some crazy shutter speed. So less light in, very sharp. People who do strobes kind of know this a little bit as well, because this is the sort of thing you do with your strobing as well, to try and get those, like if shooting somebody with a strobe with clean action, like somebody hitting a tennis ball or something like that, and you want it super clean, same sort of thing.
That's making it feel probably a lot more like a video game reproduction that we'd see on current sort of TV screen.
Yeah, video games are very much sharper, cleaner, the better. The more frames we can get out, the better.
Yep.
Particularly in esports and competitive gaming, they want 200, 400 frames a second, depending on the game. Gives them an advantage because they see things faster. It's amazing how fast our human perception is. And a lot of it is peripheral. We notice a lot more through our peripheral for movement than we do in the tact center of our vision.
Yeah.
Just as an adjunct. So overcranking is where we actually do this on purpose, and Spielberg did that on purpose for an effect. But there is, if you don't want to go that far, there is some good reasons why to do this, and this is about shooting in camera for what you need to do in post-production. And the one it comes to mind all the time is if you're in something which bounces a lot or is wobbly, or if you're moving a lot, you're having to do handheld stuff. And you need to stabilize in post. You'll find that if you don't overcrank your camera a little bit and take some of that nice motion blur out, your actual use of software stabilization will fail, or it will look really weird. So we'll get an example of that here. So let's come out. So I've got a shot here where I've deliberately done standard 1/50th of shutter. I think I've got the wrong title on that. Excuse me while I look. This one here. So it's 1/50th of in the shutter, but at 25 frames. So standard motion, standard blur. But I've deliberately moved the camera around. So it's a bit extreme, but I've done it on purpose. So you've got to think about it. Every time we move the camera, we're getting motion blur. So move it around, and the blur corresponds to the opposite movement of your camera. So if you go left to right, the blur will be right to left. So you get those streaks. So as a good example, we're getting movement from the cars which are coming towards us, but we're also getting look at these things over here, like the signpost and stuff. We're also getting another axis of movement happening with the camera wobble. Now, if we run a stabilizer on that, let's come out of that. So I'm just going to pull up the stabilizer. There's lots of different stabilizers, but we'll just use the standard here. I'm going to play it back.
So with that use of stabilizer, it's analyzing the frames within the software to sharpen them up and to do the job that you haven't been able to do by hand. Yeah,
it's trying to smooth it out as much as it can so it doesn't feel crazy. It doesn't. You can do camera lock and things, but it depends on what you're doing. Stabilizers are better for taking out the micro jitters of handheld motion and not trying to do something crazy like this. But this is a good example because if you're on a boat, like a dinghy or something, trying to shoot somebody rowing in a scull beside you, you're going to get motion from hitting the waves and stuff like that. You're not on a perfect surface. Or if you're in a helicopter or even just walking around, you'll get movement, which you probably want to try and smooth out. And this is why this is really useful. But in this instance, I've done it deliberately to look really weird. But here, we've got motion from the car moving forward, but we've got left and right motions from me. And it looks really strange. It looks artifacty in that because it can't correct the captured blur. There is no way for it to do that. This is baked in. So this is what happens when we move the camera around too much and it's set at that nice blur, shutter speed, and frame rate. If we overcrank it, we can actually pull that back a bit. So here we are at 200th of a second at 25th. And if I just skip through the frames a bit, you'll see there's some motion blur still because we're not crazy on the shutter. But everything's pretty sharp between each frame. Like the cars don't have a lot of motion blur on them. a little bit from me moving around. So there's a little bit of that parallax from other areas happening. But let's go back and then we'll just run that. Actually, I'll just run that through so you see what we're doing. That's what it looks like.
So this is then, Bruce, one of the rules that we can break when it comes to the 180 rule.
Exactly.
Unlike in days gone by when you used to have to put film through a gate and you couldn't break such rules,
Yep.
or it was harder to break such rules. Now with the digital cameras and pieces of software that we carry around and attach a lens to them, there are lots of rules that can be broken, and this is why you break them when you need to.
Yeah, exactly. So this. I like to always think about it is learn your rules, know why they're there, and then you can break them for technical or creative reasons. And this is a really good example of why you might go, look, I'm just going to forego a little bit of that nice motion blur so I can fix things later if you have to, because you never know where you're at. So here we've done the stabilization. It's now a lot smoother than me, and there's none of these weird, janky errors happening in the footage. And most people wouldn't notice that it doesn't have that motion blur in it as much. And there are ways of adding motion blur black. Not great. But this is a good reason to break the rules if you need to. Cool. Now, here's an example of what happens when you undercrank. You get this sort of weird blurry staccato effect. And this is dependent on the way the camera processes the image. Everything in the background, because I'm on a tripod, is quite sharp still, but my daughter Ebony is quite blurry all over the place. Now, this is a good reason not to undercrank, because if you go into low light situations, this is what happens a lot of the time. If you're on auto, your camera will try and slow down the shutter and you get those weird blurry effects. Same in stills, but it looks more pronounced when you're looking at it in motion. There are reasons to do this as well if you want to do it for creative effects. That's pretty much it. There's no technical reason for doing this that I can think of straight off my head. Put a comment in the system if you think there is, or if you know there is. But in this instance, I've done dance with this sort of work, where the dancers wanted that feel of motion and blur and etherealness and stuff. So it was deliberately done to make it feel ethereal and take out all that sharpness and stuff.
I guess this undercranking rule as well is the stuff that we see in TV and cinema used when someone might be affected chemically, drug or otherwise by something. So there's a deliberate choice to slow down shutter speed and make it feel wobbly and out of focus, even though it might not be out of focus feeling.
Yeah. Now, just remember, every time you make these decisions, you're baking it in. You cannot go back and undo it without shooting it again. So think about it when you're doing these things, because, it's done, it's done. It's, but there are good reasons to do it. And and in this case, undercranking is very much a creative decision that gets used very rarely. But occasionally, like, it can be done. Like, I've used it for dance performance and that, like, not so much performance in a live sense, but for actual video clips where they've wanted that weird motion, etherealness, and they've used stuff. So, and the alcohol drug inducing is very much something you've seen in the past, particularly with like in the 80s and 90s with music videos and stuff. That's, you've seen that a lot. Maybe showing my age there. All right, we got any other questions? No, I'm just having a quick look. All right, moving on. We also have so the best practices is try to do that 180 rule, and that. So so done undercrank, overcrank. All right, the other one we can do it. Is it? What was this one? Speed ramping.
Yeah, speed ramping is our next thing. David's just asked, can you shoot at a higher frame rate and reduce to an undercranked look?
You're doing the same thing to a point. I always say if you're going to do something crazy like that, is to literally go and experiment and see what feels right for the subject and what you're doing. Because yeah, it's always that thing of once it's done, it's done. You've baked it in and you can't pull it back out. So you can do that. All these things are not hard and fast rules. It's all about knowing what is standard, what is different, and how you can use it to fix errors or create things you want.
Well, I guess this question that David's got also leads into sort of the next thing that you just mentioned about speed ramping.
Yep.
And what speed ramping and slow-mo and what you can do from shooting a usual 25 frames a second and what you can do in post afterwards.
Yeah. So let's have a look at this shot here. So this was shot at 100 frames a second. Now I've got the 180 rule going on here. It's at 1/200th. Pardon me. And so it's just a pretty standard clip. Cars coming through. And what the editor is doing, because my timeline is only at 25, it's dropping 3 frames out of 4 to give me back this motion. So if you're working at a timeline which is only 20, it's outputting 25 frames a second. This is the thing when you put mixed frame rates onto the timeline. If you've got more frames than the timeline, it has to make a decision about what frames it has to get rid of to do nice playback. The nice thing about us here is that ours are really divisible. I like to think about the war against imperial and metric. We are at 25. We can go to 100. It all divides nicely. They just drop. If we're doing 100, if we're doing 50 frames a second and going to a 25, drops every second frame. If you do 100 frames, it's dropping 3 out of 4 frames to get to a 25. That's okay. And if you got your shutter right, it will still look pretty good. If you're working in, say, 30 frames a second video and then you drop it onto a 25 frame thing, then it's got to calculate which frame to drop at what point. And this is where it feels a bit weird. Back in the day, it was very hard for computers and that to do it. So it actually would speed up the output. So if you watch movies back in the 80s and 90s on broadcast television, particularly direct to TV movies, which were done digitally and not done on film, they would actually speed up the film by like 4% from memory to make it fit correctly with the frame, so it didn't have to do weird janky frame drops. It's called 3-2 pull down, and it's weird once you see it. Like, you can do a compare. It's weird. Luckily here we don't need to do that if you stick to the 25, 50, 100. But if you go, and I know a lot of people do this because they see YouTubers do it, they like having 25 or 24 and then they go to 120. They don't divide into each other evenly, and so you can get errors. So for us in Australia, I think it's a good rule of thumb to stick to 25 for your most of your content, and then look at 50 and 100 if you have the ability to do that. Not look at these other weird ones which they talk about all the time in America, like 120 and 60, because you're going to have issues with potential glitches and stuff like that. Unless you stick completely in that 20, 29 or 30 frames a second system. But as we talked about, flicker and other issues can come in to your production. All right, so moving through here. So this is 100 frames a second with a 180 rule happening. So it's a pretty, let my computer spool up. Looks pretty good, pretty standard. But what we can do is we can go to our footage and we can say, change the speed to 25%. We'll come up a little bit, and that's a quarter speed. Obviously, really, really scintillating footage here. But you can see what you can do with this. So this is like if you want to do something where you showcase people doing stuff, or you got that nice push into something, if you're doing a TV ad or something like that. This is kids jumping on trampolines, whatever. This is what you can do.
So this is creative choice in camera of slow motion.
Yeah.
Shooting it knowing that in the edit you want this piece or this particular piece that's going to be a slow motion section for you.
Yeah. But the advantage also is if you shoot like this on a regular, you can actually speed it up and slow it down without losing quality. So we'll come to here, and I'm going to just open the speed ramp tools, the retime controls. Just zoom on in. So we start here at let's pull after day. We start at 100%. So this will be at 25 frames. Then we're going to come down to that 20. We're going to go to quarter speed. So we're dropping every. So we're going. Let me explain this better. So this one is dropping 3 frames out of 4, and this one is playing every frame back because we're at quarter speed. And then up here, I've just arbitrarily made it a lot faster, which is 368%. So if we just come back and play this back, and this is called speed ramping, where you speed up and down or whatever for creative effects. And you see it a lot in television commercials and that. One of the first times I remember seeing this being creatively done was in a movie called Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels.
Yep.
With Guy Ritchie. He's well known. Him and Zack Snyder became these people that used it a lot in their films. So where are we? We'll just make sure we're at the beginning. So we'll just play it back. So we start at regular speed, then we go to quarter speed, and then we go up to over 300% speed. So it slows down, then we slow down, and then as we come on the outside, we zoom out. So I'll just play that again because it's pretty short, and my computer decided not to correctly. Slow down, and so yeah, there we go. So that's speed ramping. That's a creative tool you can use with frame rate. But if you don't shoot at a higher frame rate and you try to do this on, say, 25 frames a second footage, and then you go, oh, I want to make that half speed or quarter speed or slower, then you'll get weird artifacts. And here we go. So we've taken 25 frames a second clip, and we've slowed this right down. Ignore the actual thing at the top because it's wrong. So you can see it's very juttery because it's trying to make frames that don't exist. And how it's doing that is by copying the frame before and just holding it and holding it till we get in the mathematical timing to go to the next frame. If you want that staccato effect, fine, but most people don't. So really think about your frame rates when you're going out and shooting. So if you're doing something with speed and you want to slow it down, make that deliberate decision to shoot at a faster frame rate. But if you're doing an interview, talking to somebody just talking here, you don't need fast frame rates. You just want that standard frame rate.
So would you then probably say in that respect, as far as making that frame rate choice, especially when you're shooting your B-roll and your cover stuff for an interview or something like that, that it's probably a great thing to shoot at that high frame rate. Gives you the highest shutter speed, which probably gives you a little bit more latitude in the other decisions in making in there.
If you have the camera that can do it, yeah. So my way of working generally is to shoot your interviews at like 25 and then your B-roll at 50, and only go to 100 if it's something which has got lots of fast motion. You've got to also think about that depending on your camera, the faster the frame rate usually reduces the resolution of your actual capture or the quality of your capture depending. So a lot of the DSLRs and mirrorless, except for a few of the really top-end ones, will say, okay, we can shoot in 4K, 25 or 30, but if you go to 50 frames a second or 100 frames or 120 or whatever the actual faster versions, they might drop it down to 1080 or 720. Yep. And if you're wanting to keep your output at 1080, then you may not want to drop that far down. So you really need to look at the specs on your camera to see what compromises that you're willing to take in that respect.
Cool. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. One of the other things you'll see cameras do is traditionally there's time lapses as well, which is the opposite way of doing things, which is capturing movement over long periods of time and then shortening down so we can see it move quickly. So here's an example of just traffic. So, it's a couple of minutes of traffic going through there. And instead of looking at 2 minutes or whatever it was, it's down to like 5 seconds. Traditionally, us as photographers tend to know time lapse as something we do with stills, where you set up a camera, you put an intervalometer on it, and you let it just take photos every 10 seconds or whatever it is. This is a perfectly acceptable method and actually, in reality, a much higher quality method, but you also have a lot more post-production that you need to deal with. Now, if you're being paid to do that, go ahead. But if you're trying to run around a bit quicker, get things done, and you don't want to do any of this post-processing of conforming the footage into a video file, then a lot of cameras will have what's called S&Q mode or equivalent. S&Q is on the Sony. I'm not sure what it would be called on other ones. Slow and quick. So what that will do is if you go to the slow area, you can actually say, I only want 3 frames a second, but I'm using a 25 frame a second movie. So it will actually take 25 frames to make a second, but every frame has only been captured every 3 seconds, if that makes sense, and then combined down into a movie. So you'll get this time-lapse effect, but as a movie file straight up. Now, your cameras in your phone and that, a lot of them now do this as well. You can use the time-lapse thing, and it's exactly the same. Catch is that you're now working in video land, so you've got all the same issues with dynamic range and processing and that, so you have to work it as a video file. You don't get the latitude of working with, say, JPEGs or RAW files with a lot more latitude, but it will save you time. So if you're on a commercial job or something like that and you just need to get it done and you don't want to change too much or have an intervalometer, a lot of cameras still don't have intervalometers in them, this is a good way of actually quickly and easily making a time lapse for yourself. Now, the catch with this as well is thinking about your shutter if you're going to do it as a movie. Stills cameras tend to shoot when you do time lapse is very sharp. You want crisp images, but in this case you may want to do the 180 rule and actually have that little bit of motion blur in there because it's going to be used as a video straight out of the gate. So
and these are all settings as well that are in the various manufacturers' cameras in their S&Q speed and quick that you could go in and alter them as well. So you can shoot more frames per second, less frames per second throughout the time, depending on how many you want to put in.
Yeah. So on the opposite edge of this as well is the speed. So a lot of cameras will have the S&Q mode, and this will trip you up because a lot of time you can go into your video mode and just set it to, say, 100 frames a second or 50 frames a second, and it will play back in real time, as in it won't conform it down to play it as slow-mo. What the S&Q mode does is that it will say, take that 100 frames a second if you set it at that, and it'll actually play it back if you play it back in camera as a slow-mo. Catch with this is one, you usually need a lot faster cards for some reason, and usually a lot more expensive cards. And you will lose audio. So S&Q mode, normally 99% of the time, you will not get an audio recording on that file. That could be a problem if you're needing to do sync or anything like that. And yeah, so it's a catch-22 in that respect. You may go, I'm happy to have that compromise because then I don't have to try and make my footage slower later in post. I can just look at it real time or slow-mo time in the field. But you need to look at, what cards you need for your camera to do that and other systems as well.
Would you say for the most part though with that, Bruce, when you are putting or doing a time lapse and putting it in, you're using it as color and B-roll, and you have a overall soundtrack over that anyway. So
yeah,
the loss of sound to that that bit of motion is not a difficult decision to make.
No, not in this case, but a good example of where you probably won't want to use this is if you're doing speed ramping and you're doing, say, let's throw an example up. Like I've got you talking, oh, Matt, you're a rock star. You're playing guitar and you're singing lead vocals, and I use 100 frames a second. So I've got you singing the first line of your song, and then I do a 360 around you, and then I come back to you. But the beginning of the song, I want you to actually be in time and actually to the music with audio. And then when I go to the 360, I go to quarter speed. And then I come speed ramp back up to full speed when I come back to your face. That's where you might want it because you need it for sync or other things. Not that you can't do that in the S&Q mode, but think about your post-production because everything is about compromises and what is going to be more efficient for you to get the job done. S&Q mode is great. I personally use it more for time lapse than for slow motion. I prefer being able to see stuff in real time later in my camera in the field than trying to look at it in slow motion because then you've got to deal with fast forwarding through stuff to get to what you want to look at and things like that. But you've got to work out your workflow. These are just some of the tips I'm giving you. So that's kind of frame rates in a really quick nutshell and shutter. And they tie together real quickly. You have to one to the other. I'm just thinking, is there anything else we should go through, Matt?
Maybe. Yeah, I don't know. I'm just sitting there thinking those same sorts of things as far as the rules that we that are in place and how it is that you can break those rules to get your result. I guess probably without delving deeply into maybe a next topic, that combination of frame rate versus your shutter speed, and then the next portions of that. What's your next most important thing? ISO and or aperture or iris, as it's more commonly referred to in motion, as to that. But frame rate wise, no, I think that's pretty well covered. I think the biggest thing that most photographers first then struggle with is knowing the difference between the frame rates, why it is you want to shoot more frames to go slower, whereas normally you'd think, well, I want to go slower, so I want to shoot less frames, but it's the total sort of reverse in motion. And then choosing for your project, at least as a whole, like you said, if it's an interview based thing, you shoot that in standard 25 frames because you don't need that person moving fast or slow. But when it comes to that B-roll and that color and the overlay that you're putting in there, choosing to do it at that higher rate, that gives you that latitude when it comes to your post-production, instead of just ramping things up or down at 25 frames a second and getting those little misnomers in there that feel really odd, especially then when it comes time to the edit and you're trying to time those little movements to a bit of music or something where you're missing that key frame or two for that hit of a change on screen.
Yeah, exactly. So, it's really very much about, as I sort of said before, learn your basics, know why you do that, and then create your workflow around that. A lot of the time you may not need to use slow motion. Slow motion is something that's become very well
de rigueur.
Because cameras have only in the last 5 years really been able to do it in a quality way. It's been done forever, but we now can do slow motion in our phones and stuff like that, and it gets overused a lot. But I usually say don't go crazy on the frame rate, just go maybe double, and then it gives you a little bit of latitude if you need to slow it, and not everything needs to be slow. And also think about your processing power of your computer and stuff, because it does eat more resources, more hard drive space and stuff, because you're literally, instead of taking encoding 25 frames, you're encoding 50, you're encoding 60, you're encoding 100.
Yeah,
So there's more
everything pushes into the back end of data, of processing, of outputting, of so on and so forth. I can say that I know in most of what I do, I very rarely use slow motion. If anything, I probably tend to use the opposite of that, because for most part, I'm shooting construction, building, and those kinds of things happening.
Yep.
And you kind of almost want to speed through some of those things to say, here it is, here's it happening, and now bang, 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 we get through a whole heap of stuff really quickly on screen. Because the flip side of that is slow motion. You tend to draw things out on screen so long that there's a lot of stuff to cover up almost in doing it and using it.
Yeah. Time lapse is like the thing to use in construction. So
time lapse is my hero. I've got 2 little DJI Osmo action cameras, and they sit around on sticks and things on locations for me. They film in 4K res for me, and I can do all of those different frame rate things and what have you in them. But they're my little heroes on sites.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Well, is there any other questions in the chat? I'm not seeing any. Throw them in now or forever hold your peace. But if you've got questions and that, throw them in the comments after the live stream as well. And I'll periodically check in on that as well. I'll make sure the comments are actually on, because I was trying to work out how to do that on YouTube last time. And yeah, that's kind of it for today.
That's a good overview of frame rates, because I think that's one thing that when we first start filming and you first start looking at that menu in your camera and you have all these different decisions to make, where you don't really know what the consequence of them is sometimes, and it's even hard to see them in the edit when you get to put it into your computer and start to edit it, unless you have taken very good notes or you really know what it is that you've filmed and where and why. To start to understand and know what all of those different things mean, what the consequence of them is when it comes to editing, and how to take advantage of the things in there. So yeah, that's a really good first overview. I mean, again, same as last week, I've learned a bunch of things this week in the filming that I do, and how to start putting those things into play, especially when it comes to overcranking and speed ramping in particular. I do a lot of speed ramping sort of stuff in my edits and in my filming.
I'll give, actually, for the people who were here last week and then started looking at Resolve, let's do a bonus tip. I just think about it. All right. So in your media area on Resolve, so the first tab, first page, you can change your footage from, say, the thumbnail to the list view. Now, the list view gives you all these things like what the codec is and how long it is and stuff like that. But you can also see what the frame rate is, FPS. If you don't see it, right click on the menus up here, and you can turn on which columns you want. Now here is the trick. So you can sort and do all that sort of thing like you do in an Excel sheet to find things. But what you can do is that if you've shot anything, say in slow mo, in 100 frames, and at the moment it plays back at real time. So let's pull one here. So this is real time footage. It's actually in log, so it's not showing you the full color. So that's a different conversation. Right. But I know I'm only going to use this in slow-mo. I'm only going to use this footage in slow-mo. I don't want to have to right-click and do a lot of stuff on the timeline later. So what you can do is you can right-click on the file in here and come up to on the menu, go to Clip Attributes. And it gives you this pop-up. Let's see. I don't know if that makes it easier to see or not.
Yep.
At the top of the first tab, it says video, and it says frame rate, video frame rate. It will automatically be the frame rate which the video is shot in. So in this case, it was 100 frames. So when I place that onto the timeline, it will play back at real time by dropping those frames because my timeline is at 25 frames. Let's say I only want this in slow motion anytime I use it. So if I click on that drop down, I can change this to a different frame rate. So I want to be only at 25 frames on playback, hit OK. So now let's go to somewhere where some motion is. It'll only play it as 25 frames a second. So now I don't need to do any of that crazy stuff on my timeline of trying to slow it up, speed it down. I can just go, here it is here, and it's, oops, too many things going on at once. Get rid of the audio. And so now you can see the colors there. Now it is just in slow-mo. So this is one of the reasons why I don't use S&Q for this. I can literally just change a checkbox, and you can select lots of files at once and do it all at once. If you know all the files that you want to do only slow-mo on, just do this.
Yeah, that's I think already, even after looking at it last week, I know there's Mr. Glazebrook who's gone and grabbed it and showed me the deal, and I've done the same thing as well. And I have my fancy new little speed deck here. Yes, ready to scare me and go. And yeah, look, there's so many fabulous little tricks and things that can make and will make editing so much faster in that post-production stuff by way of group changing things and globally changing stuff in that respect before they go into a timeline.
Yeah.
So
So that's the bonus tip for today, just sort of. But yeah, if you're ever looking for what that is called, it's called conforming. So that's the key word for that style of thing. So if you ever hear it or see it in forums or whatever, it's you're conforming the frame rate. So
David's just asked in there. So frame rates aren't as flexible as RAW versus JPEG.
No, not at all.
No,
not at all.
No.
I like to say when you jump from stills to video, your box is changing. Your house you're in is changing. You're going from something which was big and you knew how to do it, had lots of dynamic range and stuff, but it's a single file, to something that's had the sides pushed in and the top pushed down, but it's added you a new dimension, which is length, which is time. So that's kind of my weird analogy, which kind of works and kind of doesn't.
Oh, no, it definitely does work, because we who are photographers generally who are stepping into this world, we are used to working on this one frame exactly like that. Like you say, just this box, and I can adjust this and touch that and do this and do that. But now in motion, you are working on 25 of those boxes in 1 second, and you've got 15 seconds of that on screen. So if there is, like within that single frame that you want to get rid of that bit of dust and get rid of that bit of dust and maybe do that and maybe do this, when you have to do that on 25 frames a second for 5 seconds, that's a huge shift in what it is that you're working on and the range of what it is that you're working on.
Yeah, so clean your sensor and clean your lenses.
Yes, clean your sensor.
Trying to remove dust spots in video is nigh on impossible unless you have a lot of money.
Unless you have a lot of money. And I would say the other tip as well is if you have the ability to have 2 cameras on a location, choose your lenses beforehand, and so you do not have to open a camera at all at any location, therefore not allowing any dust into the place. Yep.
Yeah, particularly with mirrorless these days. Yeah,
particularly with mirrorless, because they open up and the sensor of death and beauty is right there in front of you. So exactly. And cool. Yes, David Bruce should have been on commission. Blackmagic's share price went up by 0.002 of 1% this last week or so. Yeah.
Look, I just like it. There's lots of different ways of doing it, but I like Blackmagic. And I did get an email on that, and you guys pointed out the deal at the moment is, and I'm not affiliated with Blackmagic, just to say that, is that if you buy Resolve, you can get the speed editor with it, the same price. Now, I didn't know if that was still running when we did last live stream, and you guys have proven that it is. So just seek it out, because you can buy them individually. Obviously, you're going to pay double, but a lot of retailers are still bundling it together at the one price, which is great value.
And the deal that David sniffed out last week as well brought it even down to $411, also delivered for the editing speed deck and Blackmagic. So it was even better again.
Yep. So use your Google Foo, people, and get yourself a bargain.
Get yourself a bargain.
All right.
Cool.
So like and subscribe and ring that bell. We're going to continue doing this. Thank you for joining us.
Yep.
You can follow me on Instagram, bmoyle and bmoyleart. And if you've got any feedback, put it in the comments, or you can email me at hello@brucemoyle.com. And finally, I love coffee. If you want to give me a tip, drop me a coffee into the tip jar, buy me a coffee. That's great. And thank you to Mr. Glazebrook, who's on the chat here at the moment, for buying my first coffee system. Much appreciated.
Cool.
So, Matt Vass, where do we find you?
You find me at that very address, mattvass.com.au, and just Google Matt Vass and you'll find it everywhere, LinkedIn, and they're all connected under the same name, Instagram and the like. And yeah, thanks for, again, your knowledge and what you have, and letting me come on and help you share it out with the peoples that are watching and following at the moment. We will see what the next topic is going to be.
Yeah, we'll work it out. Now, just a note on timings of this, still trying to work out exactly when these will fit. We've got jobs coming up, and you do as well, Matt. So we're going to work out a regular scheduled program, but it might take a few weeks or so to get it right. But thank you for joining us.
Cool.
All right. Bye, everybody.
See you. Bye.